A photograph surfaces in September 1943, taken from a reconnaissance aircraft over Tarawa Atoll. The image shows nothing alarming: a coral ring barely visible above the Pacific swell, palm fronds bent in the trade winds, no harbors, no airfields worth the name. Japanese commanders studying similar prints in Tokyo dismissed such places as strategic nullities, indefensible specks that would absorb American blood without yielding real advantage. They expected a direct thrust toward the Philippines, perhaps Formosa, certainly not this apparent meandering through oceanic backwaters. What they failed to perceive was that each insignificant island represented not a target but a fulcrum, and that the Americans had designed a campaign to make distance itself collapse. The shock, when it came, would be metabolic, a realization that industrial might could be projected across thousands of miles of open ocean as casually as moving supplies across Kansas, and that Japan's defensive perimeter was not a wall but a sieve. The war in the Pacific had become a problem of geometry and time. From Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, 2,300 nautical miles of ocean separated American industrial capacity from the Japanese home islands. Every shell, every gallon of aviation fuel, every ration tin had to traverse that liquid desert, and the Imperial Navy assumed that distance conferred immunity, that attrition would grind down any offensive before it reached Japan's inner ring. Admiral Yamamoto himself had calculated that America's logistical tail would snap somewhere in the central Pacific, starved by submarine interdiction and stretched beyond all reasonable supply doctrine. He was wrong, but his error was reasonable. No military in history had sustained expeditionary operations at such range, and the Japanese High Command built their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that certain things remained impossible. They were about to discover that industrial revolutions rewrite the rules of impossible. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorngate stood on the pier at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, watching a Liberty ship disgorge cargo with a speed that should not have been possible. Forklifts shuttled pallets from hold to truck in a continuous ballet, each pallet stacked with ammunition crates wrapped in waxed canvas, each forklift operator working to a choreographed pattern that eliminated wasted motion. She had arrived expecting chaos, the usual tropical tangle of heat, mud, and improvisation. Instead, she found something that resembled a Midwestern rail depot transplanted to the jungle, complete with painted lane markers, traffic whistles, and a throughput rate that her pre-war logistics training had dismissed as fantasy. Thorngate carried a clipboard thick with inventory sheets, but she barely needed to consult them. The system was working faster than her ability to audit it. A chief petty officer approached, saluting casually, and reported that Berth 7 had cleared its entire manifest in 4 hours, 20 minutes, a new record. She initialed his sheet and watched another Liberty ship glide toward the dock, its hull number barely weathered, fresh from a West Coast yard that was launching such vessels at a rate of 3 per day. The mathematics were obscene, and she loved them. The Japanese had not prepared for this kind of arithmetic. Their own logistics operated on the assumption of scarcity managed through discipline. Rice and fish and ammunition parceled out in exact rations. Every gallon of fuel accounted for, waste treated as a moral failure. It was an elegant system for an empire of limited resources, but it could not scale, and it certainly could not compete with an opponent who had mechanized the very concept of supply. American doctrine treated logistics as an engineering problem rather than a resource-hoarding exercise, and the difference was philosophical as much as material. Where Japanese quartermasters counted individual bullets, American planners calculated ammunition in tons per day per division, building buffers and redundancies that would have seemed criminally wasteful to an economy running on conquest and extraction. The shock, when Japanese commanders first encountered American forward bases, was not just quantitative but conceptual, like watching someone casually discard food in the midst of a famine, except the food kept coming endlessly from ships that arrived with metronomic regularity. Tarawa would be the laboratory where this new mathematics expressed itself in blood. The atoll was a necklace of coral, its lagoon barely deep enough for landing craft, its beaches studded with obstacles and pre-sighted killing zones. Japanese engineers had fortified it with typical thoroughness, building bunkers from coconut logs and reinforced concrete, laying fields of fire that overlapped with mathematical precision. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding the garrison, boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was thinking in terms of traditional siege warfare, where defenders enjoyed geometric advantages and attackers bled against fortifications until morale or supply collapsed. What he did not account for was the possibility that attackers might simply overwhelm the defensive calculus through sheer material density, that they might accept horrific losses as a calculable cost and continue operating because their logistical tail could absorb and replace casualties faster than defenders could inflict them. This was not bravery, it was industrial process applied to combat. The assault opened on November 20, 1943, with a naval bombardment that turned the lagoon's water into a hammering, percussive surface. Shells from battleships pounded the island for hours, raising dust that obscured the coral, and for a moment the Americans believed they had sterilized the defenses. They had not. When the first wave of Marines hit the reef in their Higgins boats, Japanese machine guns opened up from bunkers that had survived the shelling, and the water turned red in wide fans spreading from the boats. Men waded through chest-deep water under interlocking fire, weighed down by packs and rifles, and the casualty rate in those first minutes was catastrophic. Reporters embedded with the assault forces sent back dispatches that shocked the American public, images of bodies floating in the surf, of Marines huddled behind seawalls, of combat so close and brutal that it resembled First World War trench fighting transplanted to a tropical hell. Yet the attack did not halt. More waves came, and more, each one absorbing losses that would have broken pre-industrial armies, and by nightfall the Marines had established a foothold. The Japanese garrison fought with suicidal determination, but determination could not replenish ammunition or reinforce bunkers, and within 76 hours the island was American. Evelyn Thorngate read the casualty reports 3 days later, sitting in a Quonset hut at Espiritu Santo while rain drummed on the corrugated roof. Over 1,000 Marines dead, 2,000 wounded, for an island that measured less than 3 square miles. The numbers were appalling, and yet the strategic community was already moving past the shock, analyzing what had worked and what needed refinement. She found herself annotated a supply manifest, landing craft modifications, Amtrak production priorities, revised estimates for shore party equipment, and realized that the system was digesting Tarawa as data, converting blood into logistical lessons. It felt obscene and necessary in equal measure. That night she wrote a letter to her sister in Illinois, a letter she would not mail for weeks, and tried to articulate what she was witnessing. We are building a machine that can cross oceans and fight battles and repair itself mid-campaign, and I don't think anyone has done this before. The cost is terrible. The alternative is losing, which would be worse. I don't know if that makes it right, but it makes it real. The Japanese response to Tarawa was confusion layered over disbelief. Intelligence officers studying the assault from intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations could not reconcile the speed of American logistical follow-through with any previous operational tempo. Within days of securing the island, the Americans had repaired the airfield, established fuel depots, and begun using Tarawa as a stepping stone for the next operation. This violated the expected rhythm of amphibious warfare, which traditionally required months of consolidation, fortification, and supply accumulation before launching a subsequent assault. The American model appeared to be something different, a rolling offensive that maintained momentum through sheer industrial throughput, treating each captured island not as a prize to be defended, but as a logistics node to be activated and immediately leveraged. Japanese strategic doctrine had no answer for this kind of operational cadence because it presumed that attackers and defenders operated under similar resource constraints. They did not. The term island hopping emerged from journalist shorthand, but it captured something essential about the American approach. Traditional offensive doctrine required seizing every enemy stronghold in sequence, reducing each fortress through siege or assault before moving forward. The American innovation, largely credited to Admiral Nimitz and his planning staff, was to bypass heavily fortified positions, leaving them isolated and irrelevant while seizing lightly defended atolls that offered better airfield sites and anchorage. This strategy weaponized geography in a new way, using mobility and range to negate static defenses. A Japanese garrison on a bypassed island might remain combat effective indefinitely, but if American submarines and aircraft interdicted its supply lines, and if American forces controlled the surrounding ocean, that garrison became strategically inert, a garrison without a purpose, defending territory that no longer mattered. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders was corrosive. They had fortified dozens of islands at enormous cost, and now discovered that many of those fortifications would never be attacked, that their garrisons would simply wait and starve while the war moved past them. Kwajalein Atoll, seized in February 1944, demonstrated the refinement of American doctrine. The assault was faster, more coordinated, and less costly than Tarawa because planners had integrated the lessons from that bloody rehearsal. Naval gunfire was more precise, targeting bunkers with delayed fuse shells that penetrated before exploding. Amtraks, tracked landing vehicles that could crawl over reefs, replaced Higgins boats, eliminating the deadly wade through chest-deep water. Most importantly, the Americans brought overwhelming material superiority to bear in a concentrated window, landing more troops and supplies in the first hours than Japanese defenders had expected over an entire week. The atoll fell in 4 days, and within a week American engineers had transformed it into a functioning forward base with fuel tanks, ammunition dumps, repair facilities, and a bomber strip capable of handling B-24s. The speed of this transformation astonished Japanese observers. One captured logistics officer, interrogated at a POW facility in Hawaii, stated flatly that such construction was impossible without months of preparation. When shown aerial photographs of the completed base, he insisted they were forgeries, propaganda designed to demoralize prisoners. He could not accept that the Americans had mechanized construction at the same scale they had mechanized production. The secret, insofar as there was one, lay in prefabrication and standardization. American Seabees, naval construction battalions, arrived with equipment that had been designed for rapid deployment. Pre-cut lumber, modular Quonset huts, portable generators, even premixed concrete in bags that required only water. They worked from blueprints that had been refined across multiple island campaigns, eliminating improvisation and reducing each task to a sequence checklist. A standard airfield could be operational in 72 hours, not because American engineers were superhuman, but because the entire process had been industrialized, broken into components and practiced until it became routine. This was Henry Ford's assembly line translated into military engineering, and it represented a kind of warfare that privileged systems over heroism, logistics over elan. The Japanese military culture, steeped in samurai mythology and the cult of fighting spirit, found this approach spiritually incomprehensible. How could mere materialism overcome dedication and sacrifice? The answer, delivered in atoll after atoll, was that materialism at sufficient scale did not need to overcome spirit. It simply rendered spirit irrelevant. Evelyn Thorngate received her promotion to full commander in March 1944, pinned on her collar by an admiral who barely looked at her before moving to the next officer. She was now the senior logistics coordinator for Fleet Service Squadron 10, responsible for planning supply chains across 3,000 miles of ocean. Her call sign, Plumb Line, had started as a joke, someone's comment about her obsession with vertical integration. But it stuck, and now she heard it crackled over radios whenever a supply question arose. The job was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, a constant ballet of requisitions, manifests, convoy schedules, and port capacities. She worked from a command hut on Majuro Atoll, where a wall-sized map tracked every ship, every depot, every forward base in the Central Pacific. Colored pins marked logistics nodes, lines indicated supply routes, daily updates showed the creeping advance of the front line westward. It was a map of industrial power projected across an ocean, and she felt a strange pride in its abstraction. This is what we are, she thought, not warriors, accountants with guns. The Japanese High Command finally began to grasp the scale of the problem during a series of conferences in Tokyo in the spring of 1944. Intelligence estimates showed that the Americans were operating over 100 Liberty ships in the Pacific Theater alone, each capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. They were building escort carriers faster than Japan could sink them, producing aircraft at rates that dwarfed Japanese production, and training pilots with a standardized curriculum that turned out competent aviators in months rather than years. Most disturbing of all, American submarines were now interdicting Japanese supply lines with devastating efficiency, sinking tankers and freighters faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Japan's entire merchant marine was being eroded at a rate that would render the home islands ungovernable within 18 months, while American production showed no sign of slowing. Some officers argued for negotiated peace, others for escalated resistance. What no one could propose was a strategy that would reverse the material imbalance. The war had become a contest of industrial output, and Japan had already lost that contest. What remained was the interval before reality caught up with pride. Saipan, invaded in June 1944, marked a threshold where operational shock became existential dread. The island was part of the Marianas chain, close enough to Japan that B-29 bombers based there could reach Tokyo. Its loss would mean that the home islands were no longer safe, that Japanese cities would burn under incendiary raids, that the war could no longer be kept at a comfortable distance. Japanese commanders threw everything into Saipan's defense: 30,000 troops, fortified positions, a commitment to hold at any cost. The Americans brought 70,000 troops, supported by a fleet so large it resembled a floating city, and the outcome was never in doubt. The battle lasted 3 weeks and ended with mass civilian suicides, encouraged by Japanese propaganda that depicted Americans as savages. The fall of Saipan triggered the resignation of Prime Minister Tojo, a political earthquake that signaled the collapse of Japan's strategic confidence. For the first time, the Japanese public began to understand that the war was lost, that the empire's defensive perimeter had evaporated, that distance no longer protected them. Evelyn Thorngate flew over Saipan 2 days after its capture, riding in a C-47 transport loaded with surveying equipment. From the air, the island looked like a wound: blackened craters, shattered trees, the geometric scars of bulldozed roads and airstrips already under construction. She could see Seabees working in organized swarms, grading runways, erecting fuel tanks, transforming battlefield into base with startling speed. The logistics officer sitting beside her, a young lieutenant named Greer, asked how long before the island would be fully operational. She checked her notes, preliminary estimates based on supply schedules and construction timelines, and said 6 weeks for the first bomber missions. Greer whistled softly, shaking his head. 6 weeks? Christ, the Japs must think we're from Mars. She didn't disagree. That night back at Majuro, she updated her wall map, moving pins westward, and felt the weight of what those pins represented. Not just territory but tempo, not just conquest but the compression of time and space into something new, a way of fighting that turned distance into a non-factor. The island-hopping campaign was not without friction and debate. Army commanders, particularly General MacArthur, resented the Navy's Central Pacific Drive, arguing that it diverted resources from the Philippines campaign and split American efforts across two axes of advance. The rivalry between MacArthur and Nimitz became legendary, a clash of egos and doctrines that occasionally threatened to paralyze strategy. Yet the dual-axis approach, messy as it was, ultimately served American interests by presenting Japan with an impossible dilemma: defend everywhere and be strong nowhere, or concentrate forces and cede vast territories. The Japanese chose the former, dispersing troops across dozens of islands, many of which were never attacked. This dispersal diluted their combat power and ensured that when Americans did strike, they faced garrisons that were isolated, unsupported, and incapable of coordinating with neighboring forces. The strategic elegance was accidental, born from inter-service rivalry rather than grand design, but it worked. Peleliu, assaulted in September 1944, revealed the limits and costs of American doctrine. The island was heavily fortified, its coral ridges honeycombed with caves and tunnels that rendered naval bombardment ineffective. Japanese defenders had learned from previous campaigns, abandoning banzai charges in favor of defense in depth, forcing Marines to dig them out bunker by bunker, cave by cave. The battle became a grinding attrition nightmare, lasting over 2 months and costing thousands of casualties for an island that turned out to have minimal strategic value. Some historians would later argue that Peleliu should have been bypassed, that it represented a failure of the island-hopping logic, a reversion to old doctrines of siege and reduction. The debate was valid but missed the larger point. Even American mistakes, even unnecessary battles, did not derail the campaign's momentum. The logistical machine kept running, absorbing losses, replacing casualties, moving forward. A Japanese mistake of similar scale would have been catastrophic. An American mistake was merely expensive. That asymmetry was the real story of the Pacific War. Evelyn Thorngate received the news of Peleliu's costs while reviewing requisitions for the Philippines invasion. She read the casualty estimates twice, trying to reconcile the numbers with the island's limited strategic value, and felt a familiar knot of anger and helplessness. These were decisions made far above her pay grade, in conference rooms where maps were abstractions and lives were arithmetic, but she was complicit in the machinery that enabled such decisions. Her supply chains fed the war, her efficiency made the attrition sustainable. That night she wrote another letter, this one to a friend from Annapolis who had transferred to the Judge Advocate General's Corps. "We are so good at this now, at moving things and building things and destroying things, that I worry we've forgotten to ask whether we should. Peleliu didn't need to happen, but it did happen because we could make it happen, and I think that distinction terrifies me." She sealed the letter, marked it for the next mail flight, and returned to her requisition forms. The war did not pause for moral vertigo. The Philippines campaign, launched in October 1944, represented the convergence of MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Drive and Nimitz's Central Pacific Thrust. Leyte Gulf became the site of the largest naval battle in history, a chaotic multi-day engagement that shattered the remnants of Japanese naval power. The battle's outcome was never in doubt. The Americans had too many ships, too many aircraft, too much fuel and ammunition. But the Japanese fought with desperate courage, throwing kamikaze pilots at American carriers in a last attempt to impose costs that might force negotiation. The kamikaze phenomenon shocked American sailors and planners, not because it was effective, it wasn't, statistically, but because it represented a kind of warfare that was psychologically alien, a willingness to expend human life as ammunition. American analysts struggled to model this into their operational frameworks. How do you deter an enemy who has embraced suicide as doctrine? The answer, ultimately, was that you don't deter. You simply absorb the attacks and continue operating, using material superiority to outlast spiritual fervor. By early 1945, the strategic picture had clarified into a single, brutal trajectory. American forces would seize islands ever closer to Japan, building airfields from which to bomb Japanese cities into submission, while submarines and mines strangled Japan's ability to import food and fuel. The endgame was visible, but the path remained horrifically expensive. Iwo Jima, invaded in February, cost over 26,000 American casualties for an island that measured 8 square miles. Okinawa, invaded in April, would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, with combined casualties exceeding 100,000. Each battle reinforced the terrible logic of the island-hopping campaign, that American industrial might could sustain losses that would have crippled any other nation, and that Japanese resistance, no matter how fierce, could not alter the material equations. The question was no longer whether Japan would lose, but how many would die before the losing became official. Evelyn Thorngate was promoted to captain in March 1945, an extraordinary rise for a woman in a military that still viewed female officers with suspicion and condescension. She now oversaw logistics for the entire Marianas Complex, coordinating supply flows to Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the islands from which B-29s were systematically incinerating Japanese cities. The moral weight of this work pressed on her constantly. She was not dropping the bombs, but she ensured the bombers had fuel, that their crews had food, that the munitions arrived on schedule. Her efficiency enabled atrocity, depending on one's definition of atrocity, and she had stopped trying to parse the ethics. We are burning cities full of civilians because it is faster and cheaper than invading. This is what total war means. This is what industrial warfare becomes. She wrote these thoughts in a journal she kept locked in her footlocker, never to be mailed, never to be shared. They were words for herself alone, an attempt to maintain some interior distinction between the professional and the human. The Japanese commanders who had initially dismissed the island-hopping campaign as foolish or wasteful now recognized it as a masterpiece of operational art, a campaign that had turned Japan's geographic advantages into liabilities. Every fortified island that was bypassed became a prison for its garrison. Every seized atoll became a logistics node accelerating the American advance. Every mile of conquered ocean shrank the distance to Tokyo. The shock was complete, the strategic reversal total. Some officers in private expressed a kind of grudging admiration for American logistics and industrial capacity, recognizing that they had been defeated not by superior tactics or courage, but by a system that could project power across impossible distances and sustain operations at a tempo that defied all historical precedent. This was not the war they had prepared for, not the war their doctrine anticipated, and by the time they understood the new rules, the game was already lost. The surrender, when it finally came in August 1945, felt anticlimactic after years of grinding advance. Evelyn Thorngate heard the news on Guam, broadcast over a loudspeaker in the headquarters compound, and felt relief flood through her so intensely it was almost nauseating. She walked outside into the humid tropical night and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over coral atolls and burning ships and all the small human struggles that had accumulated into victory. She thought about the thousands of manifests she had processed, the millions of tons of supplies she had routed, the vast logistical edifice she had helped construct, and wondered what it all meant. The war had been won by engineers and accountants as much as by soldiers and sailors, won by a nation that had turned industrial capacity into a weapon more devastating than any bomb. That knowledge felt hollow and true at once, a victory of systems over spirit, of process over passion. In the years that followed, historians would analyze the island-hopping campaign as a case study in operational innovation, a demonstration of how mobility and logistics could negate static defense. They would note the efficiency gains, the lessons learned, the way each battle refined American doctrine into something more lethal and more wasteful in equal measure. What they often missed, or mentioned only in footnotes, was the human cost embedded in that efficiency. The Marines who bled on coral reefs, the sailors who burned on carriers, the Seabees who died of tropical disease while building airstrips, the Japanese soldiers who starved on bypassed islands, the civilians who perished in the bombing campaigns. The campaign's success was built on a mountain of casualties, and the fact that American industrial power could absorb and replace those casualties did not make them less real, less final. Victory had come, but it had come at a price measured in names and faces and letters home that would never be sent. Evelyn Thorngate retired from the Navy in 1946, leaving behind the maps and manifests and the machinery of war. She returned to a country that did not quite know what to do with women who had served in command roles, who had made decisions that shaped campaigns and directed the flow of materiel across oceans. The recognition she received was polite and minimal, a few commendations and a pension, nothing approaching the acclaim given to male officers of equivalent rank and responsibility. She did not resent this, or at least told herself she did not. What she had witnessed and enabled was too large for medals, too complex for parades. In her later years, she would occasionally speak to military history classes, answering questions about logistics and supply chains, and students would nod politely, taking notes, not quite understanding that she was describing the machinery that had won the war. Not courage, not tactics, but the ability to move beans and bullets and fuel across thousands of miles of ocean with metronomic regularity. That was the secret, such as it was. That was the shock the Japanese commanders had felt, the sudden realization that they were not fighting an army but an industrial system, and that the system was relentless. The island-hopping campaign reshaped military doctrine for the next 70 years, establishing principles that would echo through Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and beyond. The primacy of logistics, the necessity of air and naval dominance, the power of bypassing strong points in favor of strategic mobility. It also established a darker lesson, one less often acknowledged, that industrial democracies at total war become something other than democracies, that they build machines of conquest and supply that operate with inhuman efficiency, and that those machines, once built, are hard to dismantle. The America that emerged from the Pacific War was a superpower, yes, but also a nation that had learned how to wage industrial-scale warfare, how to calculate casualties as acceptable losses, how to project power globally without apology or hesitation. These lessons would prove both invaluable and corrosive in the decades that followed. On a quiet afternoon in 1962, Evelyn Thorngate sat in her garden in Virginia, reading a newly published history of the Pacific War. The book praised the island-hopping campaign, detailing its strategic brilliance, its operational innovations, its decisive impact. She read the chapter about Tarawa, about Kwajalein, about Saipan, and recognized her own work in the footnotes, anonymous references to efficient supply coordination and unprecedented logistical throughput. The author had gotten the facts mostly right, but the tone felt wrong, too triumphant, too certain. She thought about writing a letter to the publisher, offering corrections or context, but decided against it. History would tell its own stories, and she was too old to fight over interpretations. What mattered was that she had done her job, had kept the supplies flowing, had enabled the victory. Whether that made her complicit in the costs or essential to the outcome, she could not say. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps that was the nature of total war, that everyone was complicit, everyone was essential, and the distinction between the two collapsed under the weight of necessity. The sun was warm on her face, and the garden smelled of roses and cut grass, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the manifests and the maps and the long nights of calculation. She thought instead of the stars over Guam, the moment the war ended, the silence that followed the loudspeaker's announcement. That silence had been sacred, a brief caesura before the machinery of peace began to grind forward, and she held it now in memory like a precious thing. The world had changed, and she had helped change it, and the cost of that change was written in coral and steel, and the names on memorials she would never visit. This was the legacy, not glory, not triumph, but the knowledge that industrial systems could bend geography and time, could make the impossible routine, could turn distance into a footnote. The Japanese commanders had been shocked because they believed in limits, and America had taught them that limits were negotiable, that with enough steel and oil and ruthless efficiency, the Pacific could be crossed, the islands could be hopped, and an empire could be dismantled piece by calculated piece. She closed the book and set it aside and went inside to prepare dinner, and the garden continued its slow bloom, indifferent to history, indifferent to shock, indifferent to everything except the patient, mechanical turning of the sun.